Okay, so in part 3 I want to talk a little bit about subculture, and on the screen here there's a picture of the mods with their heavily tinkered Vespers, and so this is a good example of what I'm going to talk about later in terms of bricolage, in terms of tinkering and reusing everyday products, where the motorbike there is used as a way of getting around, of going to work and going to gigs and stuff like that, but it's decorated and reinvented in particular ways that make it identifiable with this group, the mods, and therefore it's argued that this can be an example of freedom of expression and creative forms of consumption. So in terms of youth culture, subculture has been a really key way of thinking about kind of resisting forms of popular culture and consumer culture behaviour. Certainly the teenager was something that was kind of invented after, in the 50s, after particularly the World War II, when there seemed to be a kind of rising middle class. There was more money that parents had to give their kids to buy stuff, and there was a kind of retail psychology around creating this teenager as a kind of new market in a way, particularly as the teenager could put pressure on parents to buy them things. That was largely seen in a kind of mainstream way of thinking about how consumption works, and there is problems between this kind of mainstream and alternative distinction. But if you're interested in that kind of aspects of the contemporary commodification of childhood, have a look at the documentary I've linked there called Consuming Kids. What I'm going to focus upon here is the ideas that come out of subculture theory and then some of the critiques of that. Certainly if you've just done Soccer 1010 or you've done Soccer 3220, Youth Culture and Risk, you'll be familiar with these ideas already. So you might want to move through towards the end of this section where I go into the critique of subculture in more detail if you've already come across this stuff. The ideas of subcultural theory kind of bring together a few different kind of concepts from different social theory lineages. There's the idea of hegemony, this notion of moving equilibrium within culture, the idea of bricolage, which is remaking, reusing and synthesizing everyday things to form new symbolic forms, and appropriation, the artful creative processes around transforming commodities from their intended use into a signed system of a subculture's own making. So you see here I'll be drawing on semiotics that I looked at in week 1, and also other kind of ways of thinking about how consumer culture is done. So subculture is particularly associated with the Birmingham School from the late 60s, 70s and 80s, which was a really influential school of cultural studies in the UK. It's also associated with the Chicago School from the 30s, 40s and 50s as well, that started talking about subculture more generally, particularly around crime. The Birmingham School take their ideas and make it more specific towards notions of pop culture and consumer culture. So there's lots of really interesting researchers here: Stuart Hall, Dick Hebditch, Paul Willis, Angela McRobbie, Johnson and Jefferson. So if you're interested in this stuff, check out their works from the 70s. It's all real interesting stuff. Some of the subcultures seem a little bit dated now, but it's a kind of nice history lesson and a really good way of getting an understanding of what subculture theory was dealing with at the time. It's particularly important to remember that many of the researchers in this realm were actually insiders in the subcultures they were looking at. So where the Frankfurt School kind of perception as kind of philosophers, in the academy, writing about things from a distance, the work that came out of the Birmingham School was much more anthropological, in the sense that they were often doing ethnographies and participant observations within the scenes that they were working on. So this idea looks at notions of positive mass consumption, specific ways of consumption that may be resistant to dominant norms. In particular, the Birmingham School started to equate specific forms of consumption with specific social groups, whether that was young people, the working class, or young women, and so forth. So there's a kind of notion here that there's more than one culture. There's not one kind of whole culture in society. There's often multiple things going on in different realms and different spaces. Certainly the key texts here are Dick Hebditch's Subcultures, the Meaning of Style, and the original collection of the Birmingham School's papers, 1976, called Resistance Through Rituals. And resistance through rituals itself is a kind of concept here that is important to think about when it comes to subculture. So we're looking here at what's called the politics of pleasure, where the expression of subversion and opposition to dominant forms of politics are kind of done through these specific forms of subculture activities. So it's much more positive in terms of some aspects of popular culture, but importantly here they kind of move from the elitist position of if it's popular it must be bad, to a kind of slightly less elitist position, where if it's popular it must be bad, unless it's done in this kind of specific ways by these specific people. Certainly there's examples you're probably well familiar with: punks, goth, mods and rockers, riot girls throughout the 90s and the rise of rave culture in the 90s, culture jamming, which was a kind of specific form of rebellion that we'll look at in future weeks, and even things kind of that weren't not necessarily creative, even kind of violent subcultures like football hooliganism in the 80s and 90s in the UK in particular were kind of analysed through the lens of subculture. This looks at the notion of kind of culture as just being ordinary, the everyday lived culture of everyday men and women. So as I said, a much less elitist, more anthropological approach, and it kind of looks at the ways that people live different lifestyles, even if it's within a kind of more overt, dominant capitalist consumer culture. So there's not just one culture. An individual's social experience and cultural activity is shaped by their gender, age, ethnicity, and for the subcultural theorists to begin with, most importantly, class. They draw on semiotics and the Italian notion of hegemony. So here, popular culture and consumer culture becomes a site of struggle, where some people that want to resist dominant forces create their own ways of consuming, their own forms of popular culture that kind of express an opposition and a resistance towards the dominant norms and the dominant groups of society. Subcultures tend to be set up in opposition to the kind of normal mainstream that's seen as, lame and boring, or fascist and things like that. So it draws together hegemony and semiotics, in particular Dick Hevdage's Meaning of Style. It's an analysis of punk, does this, and it's again a great book to read. It's a really good place to start if you're interested in this. So hegemony here is from Gramsci, who argued that basically what has to happen in a capitalist society for it to continue, for there not to be a revolution, that the dominant powers have to sometimes give up some of their power and allow those in less dominant positions some autonomy and freedom. Otherwise, things will become, too alienating, too exploitative, and there may be that kind of revolution that Marx talked about. So Gramsci coined this hegemony, this kind of constant balance between coercion and consent that happens. Hevdage calls this a moving equilibrium, and this moving equilibrium happens around popular culture, where people struggle over what's dominant and what's resistant, and even struggling over kind of what should be the dominant norms here. And you can see this kind of moving equilibrium happening today even, not so much around subcultures, but particularly around gender, politics and feminism, around the co-optation of African American culture into kind of mainstream culture. We'll look at this a little bit more detail later in the course as well. So pop culture struggles are ideological. They're a contested site for political constructions of the people and the power block, and people kind of situate themselves in relation to those things. Importantly here, resistance isn't about creating a revolution. It's symbolic and it's through rituals, not necessarily challenging the system as a whole, but creating a measure of autonomy to live within it. And here you can kind of hear resonances with Michel de Certeau's work on making do. So certainly again, what subcultures do is they use semiotics as a kind of form of politics. They create their own science to display their outsider rebellious kind of practices. So in this sense, that 1970s original Mohawk, that itself was kind of a co-optation of Native American headwear. But it's meant to kind of have connotations of being a punk, of being aggressive, being rebelling, of being an outsider. So in that sense, it's not just a fashion, it's actually a symbolic form of politics. I have this haircut that represents who I am as an outsider. Other examples of this are done through notions of bricolage in particular, where bricolage is kind of a kind of creative reworking and tinkering with everyday objects. Tinkering with cultural products, icons, where you borrow, combine, recombine, discard, do all this kind of stuff to create something new. So again, kind of having a particular, symbolically violent haircut is one example. Certainly the way that mods used and adapted their scooters is a good example in the photo there earlier on. Also the way that mods wore suits. They wore kind of the symbol of, capitalist patriarchy, business suits, but they tinkered with them. They played with the cuffs, and they wore more sometimes flares and skinny ties, and they did all kind of symbolic changes to them to kind of challenge that kind of dominant norm. Other examples would be graffiti, the way that kind of everyday walls in public space can be used as a kind of artistic canvas. The reuse of everyday car parks were kind of meant to be spaces for people to park their car, to go to work or to be consumers. Skateboarders kind of reinvent those places. So again, that's a form of the bricolage of a space, where the space is meant to be used for one particular form of practice, and people use it in these other ways. You can see the ways that things like Barbie and Ken dolls are used to make porn cartoons as a way of kind of criticising with the gender narratives of Barbie and Ken. You can check those out on YouTube. Culture jamming is a good example. Again, I'll look at that in a week or two. And the ways also that kind of some subcultures start to reappropriate public space, like abandoned industrial spaces to have gigs or to set up raves. These are all examples of bricolage, the way that alternate subcultures use, reuse and tinker with the everyday norms of a particular thing or a particular space, and to do it in a creative way to express their own everyday politics. Okay, so there's lots of criticisms of subculture. So subculture has been like a really key idea in the understanding of youth culture in particular. Almost as it was happening, people within the Birmingham School were starting to criticise it. Certainly McRobbie and Garver's, really influential paper that was in the original collection pointed out how much subculture theory was dominated by males, male practice. It was about what happened in public space and not really kind of looking at what was going on in the domestic sphere in the home, and often gave women a subordinate role. More through the 80s and 90s though, there was kind of increasingly looking at some female subcultures, in particular Riot Girl, and even more recently around roller derby practices. Certainly the kind of term has been criticised as being a catch-all term, and the work of Andy Bennett is a good place to start there. Where more and more things start being looked through the subculture lens, it becomes kind of increasingly meaningless. And this is particularly problematic when trying to create kind of distinctions between so-called alternate and mainstream practices. In particular, how mainstream practices and consumer culture is really good at co-opting rebellious practices and selling it back to the consumer as a higher price. Other more kind of empirical observations started to question whether subcultures were all about resistance. Maybe they were as much about fun, people were just actually having fun, not necessarily resisting, although the very notion of fun can be seen as a way of resisting, dominant norms of kind of having to work all the time and stuff. Others argued that working class culture in particular was being over-romanticised here, that many of the original punks, for instance, were really middle-class art students, and maybe resistance itself needs to be actually material than symbolic. Often the role of the media was overlooked in terms of their maintenance and the creation of them, but certainly there was lots of really interesting media analysis around the moral panics around subcultures. So this has all led from subculture theory throughout the up to the late 80s, early 90s, start to then have a kind of resistance against it in many ways through what's now becomes called post-subculture theory. And this kind of points out that maybe subcultures are elitist as well, as I mentioned earlier. If it's popular, it must be bad. If it's popular, it must be bad unless it's popular with the right people. Difficult in making distinctions between mainstream and non-mainstream practices, and this reclamation of kind of the idea of dupe. If you're not doing it in these ways, everyone else is still a dupe. And so, in many ways, the work of Michel de Certeau is kind of cited within the post-subcultural analyses as a way of kind of thinking more broadly about everyday resistance. So in many ways, it's arguing that you can have a look at the quotes there about how subculture is left meaning everything and nothing. Now, certainly subculture theory is still really interesting, and there still are subcultures around. They come and go very quickly. I would say that it is kind of not particularly useful, I think, for looking at the ways of everyday young people's cultural practices. But it's still really influential, kind of like the Frankfurt School in many ways, as a way of thinking about more autonomous ways of consuming, And so the subcultural theories and aspects of them are still brought into the ways of thinking about those things, even if we're not talking specifically about a subculture themselves or itself. Okay, to conclude, so this week I wanted to bring together in a way many of the kind of tropes we've looked at throughout the course so far, through this idea of the sucker and the savvy. And we can understand aspects of consumer culture through those kind of figures, I suppose. But it's important not just to kind of play them off of being one or the other. It's more like they're either or, I think. There's different kind of ways in our lives where we might be more of a sucker, and there's different things we may do where we might be a little bit more savvy. The sucker kind of side of things, the Frankfurt School and the retail psychology stuff shows and highlights aspects of structures and powers, and power, I suppose, and that kind of the way that class in particular plays a role in maintaining those structures. But they're a bit monolithic in that sense. I'm not sure I know many kind of just total cultural dupes. I think we're all cultural dupes in some ways, but not so much in others. The savvy theories, I think, highlight more the way that we live in our day-to-day lives, but they may have a tendency to over-romance consumption. And particularly the savvy theories certainly kind of bracket out the environmental and health issues that go around overconsumption in particular. So we'll be starting to look at aspects of that throughout the course from here on, although the next content lecture will be about the work of Daniel Miller, who I think is particularly interesting to look at this stage of the course, in terms of the way that he argues that materials and things and the consumption of them have always been central to what it means to be a human.